All right, this is Citizenship and Immigration Attorney Parviz Malakouti. Welcome to our 57th Mobility Space. Today is 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, March 2nd. And today we're talking about war on Iran, what to expect. And just as a reminder, this is part of our mobility series of spaces on the hottest topics in dual citizenship, sovereignty, freedom, passports, and of course, freedom of movement. So anybody is welcome to speak. All you have to do is hit the request button and I will approve it right away. And what I'd like to talk about in this space is just have an open discussion on what we see happen, first of all, generally speaking, in times of war with regards to citizenship and mobility, kind of common dynamics that we see occur. And then just give our own, informed speculation on what we are seeing right now with regards to this war on Iran and what we expect to happen in the coming days and weeks. So, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, United States and Israel attacked Iran on Saturday, killed Ali Khamenei, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran. And Iran, of course, has struck back against Israel and against a number of U.S. military bases in the region. And this has a lot of second and third order effects, right? And one thing that I've been seeing on social media is Dubai's image. It might be taking a hit, an image as a safe haven in the Middle East. But almost immediately we see a few things happen, right? When countries go to war. So first of all, obviously, putting aside the physical danger that people are in Israel and Iran, and to a lesser extent in some of the neighboring Arab countries, countries close their consulates in Iran, right? Close their consulates or at least bring them down to essential services, which of course means typically no visa and residency applications, right? So we've already seen that happen in Iran. A number of foreign consulates have already closed or gone to essential services only. UAE, Slovakia, UK, Ukraine, New Zealand. And then also because of, in part, the threat of Iranian missiles in the region, as well as anti-American sentiment, the United States also has closed a number of consulates in the Middle East, okay, outside of Iran. So UAE, Manama, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are down to essential services. Beirut is only essential services. There's more examples. So right away, we see a contraction on consular services, right? And consulates are typically where people apply for visas, for foreign visas, right? So that's a contraction. Iranians are already quite restricted in terms of where, as a practical matter, where they can apply for foreign visas. We already see a contraction there, as well as other people being affected as well, too, right? If you're a resident, even if you have nothing to do with Iran, if you're a resident in one of those countries neighboring Iran or another Arab country and the U.S. consulate closes, obviously that's going to be a postponement for your visa appointment. And we've seen that happen. I tend to think that one of the most interesting dynamics that we see in wartime is the effect on nationality, what I call nationality toggling. Okay. And what I mean by that is a person who's a dual or triple citizen that basically kind of can switch back and forth. They're always of basically presenting themselves in a foreign country. Still in our current system, typically when you go to a foreign country, whether it be apply for a visa, apply for entrance, or do anything, you kind of only have the face of one of your citizenships. That's kind of the way things work right now, right? There's this concept of operative nationality, right? So if you are a triple citizen and then you go to a fourth country, right? Typically, it's not every country, but most countries in the world kind of recognize that for the purposes of how they treat you, you have one operative nationality when you enter that country, right? And people who are dual or triple citizens have this ability, like we said, to kind of choose the foot that they put forward, the face that they put forward in terms of their nationality. And it's oftentimes basically literally what passport and citizenship they present when they're actually at the border. That's not always the only consideration, but that's a big one and typically a very common trigger for basically the operative nationality. And so in times of war, we obviously see, we see more opportunities and more incentives to nationality toggle, right? Iran, there's tons of Iranian dual citizens. There's tons of Israeli dual citizens, right? And obviously people who are multiple citizens, I think most people, when they're traveling to a third country, they kind of have a little bit of an awareness of what they think is probably the best citizenship that, they can travel under in order to be best received in that foreign country. So I think that's one of the most interesting dynamics. I'd like to talk about that. Patrick, by the way, is co-hosting today, so I'm going to have some questions for Patrick, and then everybody can join in. Anybody who has something to say or disagree with, they're all obviously more than welcome. The other thing is the other aspect of nationality toggling is specifically American dual nationals, right? What about potential anti-American sentiment in the region, right? So American dual nationals, obviously, to an extent, when traveling around, can nationality toggle, use their French citizenship or their UK citizenship or whatever else it is that they have. So that's one thing that I'm interested in talking about. I'm interested in talking about Dubai's image. I'm interested in talking about the closures. Okay, I'm also interested in talking about dual nationality for federal security clearances. Right. So we've spoken on previous spaces about how most countries, in the United States included, at least most countries that I'm aware of, okay, if they allow dual nationals to have a federal security clearance, the decision of whether to grant the clearance depends on basically the connections, for lack of a better term, the connection to that foreign country, okay, and then obviously which foreign country that is, right? At the top of the list, in terms of being at the top of the list of factors as far as being granted is basically dual nationality with a foreign country which the country is allied with, and then obviously at the bottom of the list is going to be a country with which the person is a dual national that they have, a fraught relationship with or at war with. In the United States, there are Iranian American dual nationals that have federal security clearances, at least at the first level. They exist, right? Some of them still make it, and then of course some are denied as well. We'll see what happens as far as federal security clearances are concerned for American dual nationals, especially with Iran. So anyway, that's kind of my start. Like I said, this is open. This is open. This is free flowing. We could take the conversation wherever we want. I want to kick out a first question to Patrick, the juicy question, right, which is getting a lot of kind of gossip on social media or people, making fun of Dubai influencers. First question for Patrick is Dubai's image as a safe haven on the ropes just yet, or is it going to take more missiles from Iran? And just I checked right before we went live. As far as I can tell, only 3 people have been killed in Dubai. Obviously, we don't want anybody killed in Dubai. It's not something to gloat over. But 3 people killed in Dubai, 68 injured. That's what I was able to see so far from either shrapnel or Iranian missiles or Iranian drones. My question for Patrick is: has Dubai already taken a big hit image-wise as a destination, or is it going to take more?
I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say it's going to take more. I think Dubai attracts people not because of its physical security. I mean, you look at Dubai on a map, and you know, depending on one's politics and understanding of kind of the geostrategic tensions of the Middle East, uh, Dubai is pretty safe on paper, but if you take a pretty macro view on a long enough time horizon, you know that it's not Switzerland and it's not the Southern Cone. So I think people move there not necessarily for global conflict reasons. They move there for um, taxes and lifestyle reasons. And so for that very reason, the fact that it pitches itself as lifestyle and taxes as a destination, it's not being hit on the main things it advertises as. Um, I would say that I think it's I think that if we're doing some conflict analysis, Iran was smart to hit commercial targets as opposed to more strategic targets in Dubai, because it's commercial targets, like kind of like the Fairmont there and the Palm, are its strategic. In some ways, they're its strategic assets. It's a destination for capital and people as opposed to tools of force. So you know those targets are unfortunately expected, but again, it doesn't market Dubai doesn't market itself as as a bunker scenario or a World War III situation. So I think it would take a lot more. I think the one thing that we might see out of it in the future is kind of a diversity of, um, you know, emigration points. So if you're in a place and you're like, wow, conflict has arrived, I need to get out of here fast. Having a central comprehensive airport like Dubai International, which is, for commerce is beautiful, and it's like specifically designed so that they don't have to have multiple airports. Emirates Airlines operates a global hub there, and so it makes sense to have everything centralized. But part of the documented evidence online of not just the damage from Iranian missiles is the lines it takes to get out of Dubai right now. And so I think there's a question there for the future if someone wants to kind of proactively plan. I think Dubai does a pretty good job at planning 5 to 10 to 15 years ahead, unlike most places in the United States. So maybe that's the solution. But I think for right now, it's a short-term hit. But in the long term, I don't think, unless something worse happens, I don't think it's going to be that big of an impact.
So to be clear, Patrick, there's two things, right? There's image, and then there's whether it is actually still relatively safe or not. I definitely would agree that it's still relatively, I mean, still safe. I mean, those are really low numbers so far. But image is a fickle thing, right? Especially for people who kind of look at things on the surface, right? Just a few videos of a drone hitting a building, an explosion, that type of thing. Those types of things can sometimes have outsized effects. And I tend to think, that a lot of the people that are attracted to Dubai, maybe this is just my bias. I'm not a huge Dubai guy, but I tend to think that a lot of people that are kind of wowed by the brand of Dubai are kind of, look at things a little bit on the surface level. So you think even the image is just still unaffected so far, with regards to its safety.
Yeah. In the medium to long term, yeah, I think maybe for the next 6 months, maybe a little bit. But I don't think that how Dubai markets itself as a destination for capital and people is going to be that much of an impact, right? It'd be different if they were marketing themselves. Think about it like this: if you're in Mexico and you're advertising, or you want retirees to come to Mexico, like physical safety and access to infrastructure is key, right? And that's why you see very specific regions of Mexico successful in that department and most not successful, attracting like the retiree crowd. But Dubai is not attracting. They're not looking for that. They're looking for, high income, high spending individuals generally from Europe, because it's like the number of British people you hear about who are leaving the UK to go live in Dubai and set up residency there. They're generally under 45, and not all of them have a family. And so I think that demographic is a little bit more risk tolerant. And so for that reason, I think the image that Dubai might have, having been hit a little bit, I think it's pretty short term, given the demographic of who they're looking to attract and kind of the options that they present.
All right, point well taken. What about these consular closures, right, Patrick? If you deal at all with helping people apply for visas, residencies, or citizenships, you know that consulates and embassies are basically choke points for human freedom of movement, right? You have to apply typically for those types of documents at consulates abroad. And different countries have different rules with regards to which consulate of theirs they will receive a foreign applicant at. But typically, most of these consulates are, or most countries kind of want to funnel applicants that are resident in the country to consulates that are basically their consulates that are located, in that district, right, in that country, for lack of a better term. And then also one dynamic that we have for all foreign applicants that are applying at consulates is the applicant has to be able to physically be present in the consulate, right? So if so just to take a typical example, if you're applying for a visa from a foreign country and you're resident in one country, typically you go to the foreign country's consulate that is in your country of residence, right? But if your consulate is closed, or if the foreign consulate is closed because for whatever reason, war or any other type of geographical disaster, oftentimes you have to, or most of the time, you have to go abroad to a foreign consulate. You have to have some sort of right of entry to that foreign country to basically be able to apply at the consulate. So we've spoken about this before on previous spaces. I think that the factor of consular availability and the ability to apply at consulates, and also the fact that generally speaking, residency and visa rules are not applied uniformly at different consulates, even though they're supposed to be a reflection of the same rule. The reality is, in many, many cases, consulates kind of treat, they're kind of like little fiefdoms with their own little rules at the margins. Like, yeah, generally they'll apply the same rules with regards to, visa residency or citizenship eligibility, but at the margins they'll have different little rules and kind of quirky little requirements that they put in place, which can actually, really throw off an application. So consular availability, in my opinion, and I think Patrick as well too, is just really, really underrated, basically, in terms of how important it is as a factor. So my question for you, Patrick, is, and as far as I know, Patrick, you probably don't deal that much with consulates in the Middle East, given your work doing CBD, citizenship by descent. But if you did, how concerned would you be about the ripple effect of consulates being closed down for, let's say, Iranian visa applicants, or let's say applicants for visas that are resident in Dubai. Basically, anybody who would be dependent on a foreign consulate in the Middle East right now. Um, how concerned would you be because of the consular closing ripple effect?
Yeah, I would be concerned. I'm gonna start by giving a little bit of a premise, but I promise it's related. Um, Anytime I think of consular services, I consider the government's perspective in protecting their own people, because even though we see consular staff as like, better than a DMV worker, but not quite an ambassador, they're somewhere in between. Um, those people are they're government workers, but they're highly specialized, even though their demeanor might not communicate that sometimes. Um, and there's huge political and government ramifications if someone were to be injured or stranded on the job. And you've seen that historically in the past, particularly with Iran, but in other scenarios as well, not just for the United States. And so, anytime there's conflict and there's the closure of consular services, it's not just, there's two sides of that coin, right? The government doesn't want to adjudicate consular problems if there's a conflict. That kind of makes sense. But on the flip side, they just don't want egg on their face should something happen to part of their diplomatic corps. And so um, with that, when conflict arises, it's an X factor, right? In the United States, we don't see conflict, thankfully, too frequently, but in certain parts of the world, conflict will arise on a long enough time horizon, right? That's true in Eastern Europe. That's true in the Middle East. That's true in Africa. That's true in Latin America. Is it going to be 5 years? Is it going to be 30? We don't know. But at some point, conflict will happen. And when that happens and you anticipate needing an insurance policy for consular access, it's worthwhile to say what generally is the policy for consular closure. And so if there's consulates that are closed in Iran, then the question would be, do you have access to a third party consulate service? Oftentimes, if the United States closes a consulate in a location, they will have a backup or a neighboring country with a land border. And it's pretty inconsistent. Like, how do I say this? It's inconsistent from country to country, but it's relatively consistent within each country over time, right? So, if you're in North Korea and you need access to an American consulate, you go to the Swedish consulate. That's typically the go-to consulate for anyone who doesn't have formal relations with North Korea, right? And so find that arrangement for the country you're in so that you can have a plan in place potentially to get consular access, right? Um, it probably pays to have residency in Dubai if you're in Iran, if you're able to pull that off beforehand. So then you could potentially, access, mobility benefit begets a mobility benefit in a time of conflict. And so that's a very long-winded way to say it pays to plan ahead. And if you're in a part of the world where conflict over a long enough time horizon is a known risk, it pays to do the back of the napkin analysis, knowing that governments will protect their diplomatic corps and leave you stranded. So plan accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the ability to access foreign consulates in the country is kind of one of the lesser known benefits of citizenship or residency. It's not, I don't think it's enough of a benefit to be like a first, second, or even third consideration in most cases. But sometimes, I mean, depending on the profile, sometimes that value can be important enough to basically, to actually warrant getting the foreign residency, right? So, in Iran, the United States doesn't have any, diplomatic relations with Iran, so they don't have a consulate or an embassy in Iran. Switzerland handles U.S. interests in Iran, and conversely, in the United States, Pakistan has an Iranian interest section in Washington, D.C. to handle Iranian interests. For Iranians who apply for U.S. visas, they're typically routed. So what I mean by typically is an Iranian who's citizen of Iran, only resident in Iran. They're typically routed to one of three consulates. It's Yerevan, the UAE, or Turkey. But here's the thing: when you're citizen or resident in a foreign country, you now have the person now has the ability, the chance of claiming the right to go to a consulate in that foreign country. The United States Department of State, was kind of wishy-washy about this. They didn't really have tight rules. It basically said that you're entitled if you have residency in the foreign country, but it was kind of not, they weren't very tight with that. And in fact, a few times I did actually use that to the advantage of an Iranian client of mine. One time in Cyprus and a couple times in other countries. Basically, we got temporary residency, right? And by the way, in most countries of the world that have quote unquote digital nomad visas, which are very quickly processed and very easy to get, most of those are classified domestically as a temporary residency permit. Okay, so we got a temporary residence permit in Cyprus, and she actually attended. I emailed the consulate ahead of time, and we basically asked them, ahead of time before she would get the flight and all that, if they would receive her there, and they said yes. We showed proof of it. The thing is, now that's being tightened up, right? And the United States and some other countries, they're kind of more want either citizenship or permanent residency. But the bottom line is, it is a benefit. It is a benefit of picking up the secondary residency or citizenship. And this is one of the reasons that I say mobility begets more mobility, right? Because just the fact of having the second residency or citizenship, in addition to all the direct mobility benefits that you get by that, it also means now you have another country in which you have a claim to access foreign country consulates in, right? So yeah, that's one big thing. And with regards to Iranians, right? Estimated 90 million Iranians. Um, you know, the the profile and the incentive structure and the mentality with regards to this attack on Iran of an Iranian that's resident in Iran, okay, and only has Iranian citizenship versus an Iranian that's either has a Plan B residency or has a second citizenship or lives abroad. They're actually different, okay, in my opinion. And I made a post about this 2 days ago, right? Basically about how the way I see it, the incentive structure is different. Yes, both groups want a happy, successful Iran, but they have totally different incentives when it comes to what their risk tolerance is for Iran to basically be successful, and it's because the latter group, the one that has a foot outside of Iran, okay, they can moat themselves, okay, they can insulate themselves, okay, from the blood, the guts, the bombs, everything that's falling on Iran. Doesn't mean they want it to happen, but it's just the consequences of war on Iran are less immediate for them and more escapable, right? And I mean, this goes back to just, what we always talk about on these spaces, and other people talk about too, which is just the value of having a plan B, right? A plan B is insurance, right? It's a lot of things. It's not just insurance, but what is insurance? It's something that you gain benefit from all the time, even when you're not exercising it in the moment. Okay, that's the same with insurance. Okay, like you have the benefit of it, and you can make decisions based on having the benefit of it. Okay, without actually having to exercise it. Plan B residency, right? Maybe for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, you barely go there, you don't go there at all. All of a sudden, there's war in the region. Okay, there's huge disaster. There's an immediate danger scenario presented itself, and then obviously you can leave right away. Obviously depending on the robustness of that plan B, citizenship being at the very highest, immediate highest right of entry and residency, permanent residence after that, temporary residence after that, visa after that, tourist visa after that, et cetera, et cetera. There's a spectrum, right? Plan B and the robustness of the escape presented by Plan B obviously operates on a spectrum. And so, people who have that versus those who don't are, in my opinion, in radically different mental spaces as far as decision making, as far as incentives are concerned. We got Alex here, Alex Ogorji. Alex, anything you'd like to, I guess I'll just throw out a general question to you. Um, what do you think? What do you think are the mobility, benefits that are most highlighted during a scenario like this, attack on Iran? What comes to your mind immediately as coming to the forefront with regards to escape and Plan B and things like that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think having access to ground transport is one thing that came to mind, as well as familiarity with chartering jets or planes more generally. So those are, I think, maybe even the chartering of planes is an interesting topic because it really can enhance one's mobility if you know how to charter planes, because there's some places you can't even access without chartering planes, and it's especially useful in emergency type scenarios. I heard some of the jet setters saying that during COVID, the jet terminal was really nice because they didn't really enforce all of the COVID measures and they often were a lot more lenient with entry. So that's something to think about. There's scenarios where chartering a plane may be the only way out, and there's also scenarios where chartering a plane may be a good way in. I would imagine, for example, with something like birth tourism, probably if you charter a plane, it's easier to get in than if you just fly commercial, because often the control is through the commercial airlines. And I imagine when the airports start to open up, if there's any restrictions on certain nationalities or certain people in some way or form, likely the airlines will be tasked with enforcing it. Whereas if you charter a plane, you might be able to find a way out. So that's what came to mind with your question.
Yeah, for the high net worth people, right? For people who for whom that type of thing is in reach financially. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. As a practical matter, but we have laws, we have rules, we have regulations. In practice, these have to be effectuated by people, and who those people are matters, right? This is why, for example, when you're boarding a flight in a foreign country, to be able to come into the country, your at first instance your travel documents are checked by airline personnel, right? And they're highly incentivized in the form of a fine imposed on the airline to not board somebody and present them that doesn't have the right of entry in that country, right? That element largely does not exist at a land border, right? When you present yourself at a land border, oftentimes you're presenting, at first instance, directly to a border, patrol, or border protection official, right? And those types might be less incentivized to really cut a wide berth around the rules. I heard from a colleague of mine, I heard from Curtis Morrison about another attorney, I cannot remember her name, who, according to Curtis, and apologies, Curtis, if you ever end up hearing this, if I'm butchering the story, but I heard that she had a lot of clients, dozens of clients in Yemen a few years ago, and she actually chartered a boat from, I believe it was Djibouti to Yemen, because those clients could not get any, flight or boat out of there, and she got them actually from Yemen to Djibouti. I gotta check into that and fact check that, but that's absolutely incredible if true, right? I think that type of thing, overland crossings, boat charterings, right? That might be kind of the skill, maybe the pleb friendly skill, right, to what Alex is talking about, right? Some, rather than just chartering the jet.
Well,
Go
the
ahead.
planes are potentially cheaper than you think. It just depends how far you're going. If you're just going within the
Good point.
region, then it's usually priced per hour, anywhere from 1,000 to 3, 4,000 an hour for a small plane. And so that could, if you divide it amongst many people, it's not so expensive. So that's something that if the airport closed right away and I had to leave UAE, I would have tried to charter a plane as quickly as possible before the rates skyrocket. And it's possible if you got in quickly, you could have gone a plane for $5,000 or less to one of the neighboring countries, like Riyadh or someplace like that, and probably could have flown out of there, or at least drive closer to Jordan or Egypt or someplace that has airports open.
No, you're
On a
absolutely.
related note,
Go
I,
ahead, David.
I'm wondering if we could briefly talk about how private pilots, if somebody has access to an airplane, how private pilots could potentially leave the country. What are the requirements for a pilot to be able to fly, let's say, a small or mid-sized plane from, let's say, a country that maybe is entering some kind of state of war or turmoil, and fly to a nearby country internationally?
I'm not equipped to answer that. Alex, do you know anything about that?
You have to file paperwork. What exactly is on the paper? I've not filed the paperwork, but I've been on a plane where the paperwork was filed. They get your passport photo and yeah, they take your photo, your passport, and then they file it with the leaving and receiving airports usually. So I imagine the pilot would have to file with the country they're exiting and then have a flight plan to another country where they file as well. But if it's a war, I mean, if they just leave, like what happens? Probably not too much, right?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, all of this is kind of implicit, I guess, in chartering a flight. I'm just wondering from the pilot's point of view. So sorry for the little detour there.
No problem at all. One other aspect that we talk about all the time in citizenship, right, is we talk about benefits and drawbacks. On the drawback side, the red flags of second citizenship, right? Probably the most commonly mentioned one, citizenship-based taxation and reporting obligations. But right behind that might be mandatory military service, right? A condition in some countries of citizenship, especially for males. We talk about that all the time, and a flare up. Well, so far it's a flare up. We'll see if this progresses into a full scale war. But a flare up in the Middle East obviously changes a person's analysis, right? Israel has mandatory military service for males and females. Iran has mandatory military service, 2 years for males, okay, or shortened to a year and some change, depending on whether you go to an undesirable outpost. Other countries in the region have mandatory military service as obligations as well, right? Turkey, Armenia, right? And so when there's obviously, when countries end up going to war, right, what might have seemed during peacetime as a far distant potential obligation that is palatable, right, suddenly comes to the forefront, right? And I don't think it's necessarily the case that that a country that from your perspective as an applicant or a potential applicant for citizenship, or as a citizen, that you got to wait for your country to go to war before you start considering the mandatory military service obligation. Sometimes being put on high alert, right, is enough to trigger, some reporting obligations, right? So let me throw this one back to Patrick, right? If you, Patrick, if you are somebody who has a claim, let's say by descent, to a citizenship in the Middle East, right? And obviously, so much of this is specific dependent, right? We're just talking in kind of broad terms to kind of flesh out some of the considerations and some of the frameworks. But if you have potentially a claim to citizenship by descent in a country in the Middle East, and you're a military age man, okay, and that country has mandatory military service, right? With exceptions, with carve outs, with waivers if you're resident abroad, right? How attractive is that citizenship, or not how attractive is citizenship, how are you thinking about whether to consider proceeding with applying for recognition as a citizen of that country? Is it on your radar at all, or you say, I'm not even going anywhere near it, or are you taking a few steps forward to kind of dig deeper?
I think it's prudent to take the extra few steps to dig deeper for a couple of reasons. The primary one is, not to get too overly analytical and historical, but the post-Cold War peace dividend, I think, has been over for some time, and the likelihood of conflict has increased, but it's also increased in its short-termism, right? How many people saw a year ago the leader of Venezuela being captured, or conflict with Iran at this scale? I mean, they were negotiating a nuclear deal like 9 months ago. So, the rate of change is increasing. There's chatter online that, the next country to face kind of the threat of force from the U.S. is going to be Cuba. We'll see how that goes. And so in all of these scenarios, if you have a citizenship by descent of a country that has military service, I think it's worthwhile to dig into, because that military service can be triggered relatively quickly. And also the age at which you need to that you're required to be registered for potential service can change during wartime, right? Like, classic example is Ukraine today, but I mean, there's a reason that you had to register up until, I believe, you were 60, maybe it was 65. I should know this, for World War II as an American. If you're an American man who was 58 years old with a family and had served in World War I, you still had to register for the draft in World War II. So I think there's elements of that to prepare for as well. And then the last one, of course, is how do you mitigate against that, right? Like, Israel's a good example. You have, it is this conscription society. I believe the term of service is less than 2 years, but more than a year. And so, most people, if they really feel compelled to have Israeli citizenship, will exercise it after that window has expired, so they get their Israeli citizenship later in life. But if you are born in Israel and you don't have citizenship by descent to any other country, you don't have a choice if you're only an Israeli citizen. And so, in that regard, during peacetime in Israel, you learn skills. It's a worthwhile experience. But as soon as conflict hits, you know, that can be quite challenging, right? And so there's ways to mitigate against it if you can get out of it through financial, providing financial compensation to the government, or, there's some countries that allow you to kind of hire someone in your place. Um, I think the smart thing to do would be to set the financial obligation aside in a very liquid account, so that, if you can do it once and be out of it, then do that proactively. If you can't do it proactively, but only when you're, during times of conflict, I would have those financial resources set aside so that you can exercise that quite quickly. I can go on a little bit, but I think there's a lot of diligence there, and there's a lot of countries that do have conscription as a condition of citizenship, and that's fine if it's a regional power where half the time their military experience as a make work program. But in places where there's a high likelihood of conflict, I think it absolutely requires due diligence.
Yeah, good point. If I'm not mistaken, I think for Israel it's 3 years for males, and I think it's a little bit shorter for females, the mandatory conscription. Yeah, great point. The thing is, judging the risk of the mandatory conscription is so difficult, in my opinion, because so many of the rules change so quickly, right? You could make your decision to step forward and apply to be recognized as citizen of one of those countries based off of a calculation that then changes after the fact, right? So it's tough. It's a tough one. You look at the United States. The United States hasn't had a draft in since I think 1971, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was 69 or 70. I think 71. Over 50 years, right? So, I think it's also prudent, in addition to looking at the letter of the law, to just look at kind of what is the, for lack of a better term, like culture around it, right? And kind of, put that into the analysis as well. But yeah, it's a tough one, the other thing is this: oftentimes there's gradations of waivers from the military service, right? So, for example, in Iran, I mean, they have, one type of mandatory military service conscription waiver for those that is temporary for those who are residents abroad, right? But that can be overridden if the country goes to war, right? There's another kind of, level of waiver for those who are, only sons of Iranian males that are over 70, right? The idea is that's your only breadwinner in the family. We don't want them to die and have elderly parents to become, a state charge. And that's a little bit more robust, right? And then, you can purchase the military service. That also has an exception to the waiver. So, when you double click on the service and the waivers, you oftentimes find in many of these countries that there's just all kinds of just little, Swiss cheese exceptions, as is the case in so many aspects of law, right? When you look at it, you see there's exceptions and exceptions to exceptions, etc. But yeah, I tend to agree with exactly what you said, Patrick. If you have potentially the eligibility, I'm always a fan of just going forward and exploring. But I mean, by going forward, it's not going forward and applying, but exploring, doing the analysis, as opposed to just saying, "Look, I'm not even going to touch this because I don't want to go near it." One other aspect that I just wanted to talk about that's kind of related to mobility, but not necessarily internationally, but I think is interesting, is having access to a rural place to live, right? And I'll just start with a little story. At the beginning of COVID, I was in the United States at the beginning of COVID, and I didn't have any, I didn't, I split time between LA and Vegas primarily, but neither of my homes are rural, like open to big places of land. Both of them are kind of in fairly, populated places. And I was thinking to myself, when I was thinking, at the beginning, I don't know how long this is going to last, stay in place, mask, don't be around too many people. And I was thinking to myself, man, this sucks. Like, I wish, if I want to be in nature, I got to go to, these, public parks and stuff. And I got to be around other people. And that kind of put the little, worm in my head about, oh, okay, like it's actually a safety, it's part of the safety analysis as an individual to have basically access to, a private piece of property that's rural. Fast forward to this situation with Iran, right? And I have family in Iran. I have a lot of family in Iran, actually, and a lot of them own farmland, right? My family is not from Tehran. They're from another city, close to another city that's more rural. And my father sent a message to our family members, basically saying, "Look, go to the farmland, go to the farm areas, right? It's totally away from population centers, away from anything that would be considered a government building or IRGC or anything like that." And that was kind of the second hit that that made me think about the safety component of having access to rural areas, right? If being around other people makes you a target. Now, obviously, that's not traveling internationally, but we can kind of include that that consideration in within the broad safety related umbrella. Let's say the broader topic of basically mobility, safety related mobility. Let me throw this question back out to Alex, because Alex was talking about kind of the pilots, the having access to charter flights. Basically, the idea is to get off the X, right? And we typically, when a country is at war, we think the X is everywhere within the boundaries of the country, right? But it's not necessarily, right? Sometimes the X is, the population centers, the government centers, the military services, the military centers, etc. Question for you, Alex. Do you think at all, do you consider having access to a rural, either a home in a rural area or a rural piece of land to be relevant at all in your analysis as far as like, let's call it geopolitical stability for the individual, for the individual freedom seeker? Does that come into your analysis at all?
Yeah, well, I think it depends what kind of city you're living in. You could make the case and the scenario as well, but generally having access to it is advantageous. But in some crisis scenarios, it may be better to be in a city than in a rural area. So that's something to consider, having access to both. But yes, generally having a farm or other remote region where you have not just land but connections, I think is quite useful, because the challenge in the rural areas is they're harder to defend potentially. The law enforcement or civilization may be far away, whether that's emergency medical aid or the police or whatever. If it's far away, then your ability to call upon your neighbors becomes a lot more valuable. So I think having a rural place and in a destination you have community is quite valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you just reminded me of an episode of IRS Medic, which I really liked. I like most of their episodes. I love the podcast, but one in which Anthony Parent kind of went on a semi-philosophical rant, but he made a great point, which has really stuck with me, which is he was talking about for preparedness, and he was talking about more, of course, in the tax concept, but he kind of tied this into just generally in life. For preparedness, one of the best, he might have said the best thing you can do is be a reliable friend. Be a reliable friend. And if Anthony, if you ever hear this, apologies if I'm butchering this, but it was something like that, and it really hit me. He said, "Be a reliable friend. When you're a reliable friend to others, people are a reliable friend to you," right? And I think he put it so beautifully. You know what? I'm going to find actually that episode and link it to this space if anybody wants to hear that clip. That applies in so many circumstances, and especially right in times like this, right? Times of attack, invasion, societal collapse, COVID, whatever. Do you know your neighbors? Do you know your neighbors? Are you an asshole to your neighbors? Okay. Do you pass your neighbor, every day and don't wave hello? Okay. Have you done, have you, showed up for your neighbor when they needed a favor, if it was a small favor or big favor, whatever it is or not? I think that's absolutely critical. And in some ways, I think it's like really low hanging fruit, right? A lot of it just requires being pleasant, being friendly, and being willing to reliably offer a favor when you can. And we've seen, I mean, obviously when societies have either partial or full collapse, whether it be, security with the police, let's say police is no longer going to your area because of Hurricane Katrina, or LA riots or whatever, or if it's because there's a food shortage or an electricity shortage or whatever, people turn to community, right? People turn around and look at community. And so I just think that's one of the absolute most underrated aspects, and yeah, I mean, to Alex's point, if you have a piece of property that's rural and you don't, you're maybe not there that often, or you don't know your neighbors, maybe that ability might be attenuated, that ability to call on your neighbors and community. I think that's a great point. Okay, so the title of this space is What to Expect. So I should probably throw out a few predictions, put myself on the line here, right? And obviously, nobody has a crystal ball. I don't either. Don't believe even the top geopolitical strategists or whatever. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. I think the best we can do is kind of apply our heuristics from what we learned from the past and common patterns and dynamics that emerge to the situation, and basically, have an idea of what we think is going to happen, short term or long term. So here are a few of my predictions. Okay, what I think is going to happen. Um, I think more foreign consulates are going to close inside Iran. Okay, I think it's going to be harder for Iranians to get visas to foreign countries, both because of the foreign consular closures inside Iran, as well as a second dynamic that happens oftentimes, commonly in wartime, which I haven't touched upon in this space, which is that when you're a citizen of a country that's at war or either in a humanitarian crisis or looks to be even on the verge of a humanitarian crisis, other countries' paths constrict for you. Okay, your exit paths constrict. Even an exit path as simple as a visa-free access to a country or a tourist visa. Okay, no country wants a foreign country's humanitarian crisis on their hands. If you're an Iranian and you have a month from now, 2 months from now, and this war has escalated even further, and you have a tourist visa to a foreign country, okay, I think those tourist visas are going to be, it's going to be harder to exercise that. Paths constrict, okay? And at the type of paths that are most likely, okay, that they're just, top of the list to constrict right away is, okay, we're suspending visa-free access. We're suspending tourist visas. Okay, these are very much at the top. Up a level from that, we're suspending temporary residency. So if for people who are outside of the country, we're not going to recognize them to come back in. And then what's more robust, what's typically more difficult, is to try to deny access to somebody who's a permanent resident or a citizen. Even Trump, okay, with Muslim ban 1.0 or Muslim ban 2.0, although he kind of tried in the first Muslim ban, that's Presidential Proclamation 9615 in the first Trump administration, he kind of tried to make it like, oh, this might apply to permanent residents that are Iranian or from other countries mentioned. It's very difficult under U.S. law, and in a lot of other countries, it's difficult under their law as well. So paths constrict. I think that's going to continue to happen for Iranians. If you're Iranian listening to this and you don't have residency in a second country or citizenship in another country, a year ago was the best time. Today is the second best time, right? Absolutely, I would say do not wait. So that's one prediction. Second prediction is I think more consulates in U.S. consulates in countries around Iran are going to suspend consular services for visa processing. I think they'll still be open for essential services, but I think that we're going to see more of that happen. And then backlash, right? There's sides, right? People are identifying, is America justified in attacking Iran? But there's also a lot of, backlash against the United States for this most recent attack, right? So if you're an American traveling in the region, right, depending on if you're a dual citizen, depending on obviously what your other citizenship is, might want a nationality toggle a little bit more than you might otherwise. Similarly for Iranian and Israeli citizens, people who are multiple citizens, right? To the extent you can, might want to, nationality toggle and travel, on those other citizenships. I think for travel within the United States, within the Middle East, I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more kind of anti-American, Israeli, or Iranian sentiment, depending on where you are, basically where you're traveling. So I think that's something, and that's nothing new. That happens, every time countries end up going to war, right? There's xenophobia that gets stirred up, right? So these are my predictions. I don't think, unfortunately, that this is going to end soon. I think we might have some lulls in the conflict. But I think from the Iranian perspective, I think Iran, I subscribe to the belief that Iran's doctrine now is that they're going to have to impose a big enough cost as far as casualties are concerned to actually deter a future threat. And so I think this is going to escalate, unfortunately. Patrick, Alex, David, Brent, anybody have a prediction that they'd like to put forth, or anybody like to piggyback on my prediction or push back or disagree on any one of my predictions?
I'm not going to push back on any because I think your predictions are pretty good. I would highlight the fact you said something about how a lot of countries don't want people at their consular services or coming into their country out of other countries involved in conflict. And I wanted to underline that because there is a few concepts as old as time in foreign policy, and it is that is one of them. If you are a country pick a European country, for example, during the Syrian crisis. It's like yes, people care about the humanitarian aspect of it, but the political dynamics or the political perception of allowing a bunch of people to come in because of a crisis outside of that country has a temporary but low tolerance politically. And so, you know, the older one that rarely shows up but showed up during the pandemic is letting in loads of people who are ill or sick from outside of the country. That's almost like that's not even just political. There's like a biological um, instincts with that one. But the idea is that, like, if there is conflict, countries have humanitarian policies for people involved in conflict, but those are generally very litigated, difficult to do from abroad, particularly with consular closures, and the high level politics are just that countries just don't have a really high tolerance for people coming from areas of conflict. I mean, look at the United States and how many people were involved in conflict at the behest of American policy in Afghanistan, and we're still shut out. So I think understanding that perspective is it's not it's a relatively easy and simple concept, but it shows up time and time again in mobility.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Patrick. Obviously, we have asylum and refugee, right? Statuses and law, but it's kind of, with the populace, it's fickle. It's oftentimes disfavored, right? And I mean, to be frank, if we're speaking frankly, part of the reason, okay, and I know this might make me unpopular with some of my colleagues, but part of the reason, these statuses can be disfavored in some instances because oftentimes they are, for lack of a better term, abused, right, by people who are applying, under criteria that's supposed to be, make them eligible for asylum, but really, really they're an economic refugee, right, which is typically not leaving for financial, purposes or to try to escape war. It's typically not, at least in U.S. law, it's not really one of the factors, that qualifies you as an asylee. So it's difficult. It's not reliable. Obviously, it's out there, but I believe, just generally speaking, the contraction of pathways that occurs for citizens of a country that are in crisis outweighs the asylum and humanitarian based immigration grounds that open up for them. I tend to think that basically they experience a net loss in mobility, all other things being considered equal. So yeah, agree with you there, Patrick, about that. David, Alex, Brent, anybody want to venture forth with a prediction about what this Iran war means for mobility and citizenship?
I think it's going to affect commercial mobility significantly. There was a use of Dubai airport and ports as a major transit hub, both for travel of people, travel of cargo, and I think a lot of people are going to reconsider that, as well as when evaluating potential safe havens, put airport and mobility as a bigger factor. I mean, what happens if this goes on for 2 months? How are they going to get food and other critical materials if the strait is blocked and the airports are limited and land borders are far away from potential supply chains to next major port? So I think that's something that people didn't take into huge account when planning. Dubai historically has had one of the best airports and flight accesses, but in time of war, you have to think about what are the other options. United States is very good because there's something like 15,000 airports and multiple coasts and many ports. The European Union as a bloc is also quite good because many airports and ports as well. So regions that give you access to multiple ports and airports, I think will become an increasing consideration for people as they do their planning.
Yeah, I think I think it's a great point, Alex. Right, that's closures and restrictions on hubs of commerce and airports is one of those downstream effects, right, as well as shipping. One other thing that I think, I guess it's kind of a prediction. I just think I think we're going into a danger zone for Iranians in the United States, right? Iranian Americans, right? Every time, when there's war, if war kicks up, right? We usually see, it's not just a unique American thing. We usually see kind of a kick up in xenophobia, right? As wars kick off, right? People become a little bit more tribal, a little bit more concerned, right? And then you start, thinking of, hearing about enemies within and things like that. And so, if this war, if Iran does inflict real casualties on the United States, I think we could be entering kind of this danger zone where, we could start seeing from the Trump administration, at least starting off increased rhetoric against, Iranians or Iranian Americans in the United States, as well as, possibly some executive action, in that regards. Hope it doesn't happen. But I just, I just think that's a very, very commonly occurring dynamic all over the world, not just the United States. And obviously, we had that in the United States too, right? World War II Japanese internment camps. Some of those people interned were not even citizens of Japan. Actually, they were just they just had heritage from Japan, right? And some of them were big American patriots. But hysteria is a hell of a thing. So unfortunately, I think that could be coming down the pike if this conflict escalates. Anybody else want to put in a last word before we wrap up and I give my pitch for next week's topic?
Yeah, Parviz, I'd like to throw the question back on you just a little bit once more. Since you're an attorney dealing with immigration issues and you're of Iranian descent at least, obviously, I think this is probably going to be good for business for you in probably a few different ways. But how do you think that Iranians in the United States or who are seeking admission to the United States are going to be looking for immigration services in the near future? Are you seeing an uptick already, or?
It's a good question, David. So Iranians have very limited access to immigrate to the United States right now. I mean, there's basically. You basically have a very difficult time right now if you're an Iranian outside the United States, unless you are, an immediate relative of an American citizen. So, like married to a U.S. citizen. Go ahead.
Let's include the Iranians that are already here. Those who are here for whatever purposes, whether they're permanent residents or otherwise.
In my experience, most Iranian permanent residents that are here want to escalate to naturalization. So, I think that's going to continue as normal. I don't think, David, that I don't think I anticipate a change in kind of the decision making of Iranian immigrants that are here because of this. They already generally want to proceed to U.S. naturalization, in my experience. And I think that's going to continue. As far as increased business is concerned, for services for Iranians, within the United States or trying to come to the United States, I'm not sure that this is going to kick up business. At least not for me, based off of the type of cases that I focus on. What I think this might do is kick up the demand for services for Iranians to pick up residency in another country that's not the United States. So Plan B residency. I think that's going to happen if this drags on for sure. Especially the upper echelon, Iranians that they have the money, but they just have never imagined or thought that they're going to want a Plan B residency. That's what I would expect to occur. And then obviously citizenship by investment as well. But these things have so many downstream effects. I mean, citizenship by investment that's open to Iranians might also face a constriction, based off of American pressure, right? Depending on, what path this conflict takes. So, yeah, I don't know. Is that your question more or less, David?
Yeah, more or less. Thank you.
Sure. No, it's a good question. Okay, so This is our 57th mobility space. We skipped last week. My bad, mea culpa. We're at an hour and 5 minutes now. Anybody have a suggestion for a topic that they'd like to speak about next week? It could be related to this conflict. If somebody feels like, there's like a subtopic that we spoke about today that's really juicy that we should double click on, I'd be happy to do that, to consider that as well. But anybody have any topics before I dictatorially decide which one to make for next week?
I was thinking about one the other day, but it is not topical. It's more of a good one to have as a back burner should we ever possibly have a slow news day or news week. But maybe the use of like specific international airports, and I use the phrase international specifically. I'm thinking of like the airport in Basel, the Euro airport that is governed by 3 countries. There's an airport. The airport in Tijuana has a land bridge from the United States that goes directly into the terminal. And so I'm wondering if there's like a way to kind of build out a comprehensive list of like uniquely international transit hubs and how that could be used opportunistically for mobility purposes.
I like that. I definitely like that. I can say we're definitely going to do a space on that. The question is whether it should be our next space. Maybe. Anybody else have a suggestion?
I think this should be in a couple months.
All right. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to take a day or two. I'll think about it. I may just choose a space. I may put up a poll, as I often do, with 3 or 4 options and let the interwebs decide. I want to thank everybody for participating today. This is our 57th mobility space. As a reminder for these, everybody can speak. Anybody can join. Make sure to join us next week, Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on March 9th. Have a great one. Stay safe out there, everybody.